The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, as far as Mara Voss was concerned, the single most offensive thing about it. Tuesdays were for the weekly accounts. For the quiet scratch of her pen against the ledger her father kept pretending he would update himself. For the sound of the kettle and the smell of bread baking in the kitchen below, and the particular piece of a morning that asked nothing of her except accuracy. Mara was good at accuracy. She had learned it young, in the way that children of struggling households learn whatever skill keeps the house from falling apart, while the adults discuss the falling. The letter sat beside the butter dish. Her mother, Clara Voss, had placed it there, with the careful casualness of a woman who has rehearsed the placement several times. The butter dish was silver and slightly tarnished, a remnant of better years, and her mother kept it on the table as a kind of argument, a reminder of what the family had once been and intended to be again. The letter leaned against it, as though the two things belonged together, as though the letter were also an argument. Mara poured her tea first. She stirred it. She looked out the window at the garden, which needed weeding, which it always needed, because the gardener had been let go the previous autumn, and no one had said so directly, but everyone understood. Then she picked up the letter. Her father, Edmund Voss, was not at the table. He was rarely at the table for significant announcements. He had a gift for being elsewhere when the consequences of his decisions landed. He would be in his study, Mara knew, standing at his window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the land that had been in the family for 3 generations and would require a miracle, or a marriage, to remain there for a 4th. Her mother sat across from her with a cup of tea she was not drinking. Her cousin Lotte, who had arrived 2 days earlier for what was described as a visit, but was clearly something else, sat at the far end of the table, pretending to read a book. The book was upside down. Lotte had not noticed. Mara read the letter. It was formal. It was brief. It used the word arrangement 4 times, and the word honor twice, and the word suitable once, in a context that made it clear suitable referred to her, not to the prospective husband, as though the question of whether he was suitable had already been settled in his favor by the simple fact of his existing and being willing. Lord Aldrich Vane of Crestmore, Northern Estates, proposed to formalize an agreement of marriage between himself and Miss Mara Elaine Voss, daughter of Edmund Voss of Hartwell, subject to the approval of the relevant parties. She set the letter down. Her mother's cup made a small sound against its saucer. "He is very well respected," Clara said. Her voice had the particular quality of a speech that has been practiced until the nerves are buried somewhere no one can see them. "The northern estates are considerable. 3 villages, I believe, and forest land extending to the ridge." "I see," Mara said. "Your father has spoken with his solicitor at length. Everything is in order." "I see," Mara said again. Lotte's book rustled. She had turned it right side up, and was now attempting to look as though she had always been reading it this way. "He is not a young man," Clara continued, with the air of someone identifying a flaw before it can be used as a weapon. "He is 36, but he is in good health, and the estates are, as I said, considerable. The forest land alone." "Mother," Mara said. Clara stopped. When was this decided? A pause. A careful one, measured and placed. "The discussions began some months ago. Your father felt it was best to wait until the terms were settled before raising the matter." Mara looked at the letter, then at the butter dish, then at her mother's hands, which were wrapped around a cup of tea she had not touched, knuckles slightly pale. "What month?" Mara asked. Clara looked at the window. "February, I believe." The initial correspondence. It was now late April. 3 months of letters between her father and a stranger in the north, arranging the terms of her life, while she sat at this table doing the accounts and drinking her tea, and believing that mornings were still her own. She picked up the letter again. Read it once more slowly this time, the way you read something the second time, when the first reading felt too much like falling, and you want to check whether the ground is actually there. The handwriting was even, not the handwriting of a man who hurried, not the handwriting of a man who was nervous. The letters were formed with a steadiness that suggested someone who had written a great many letters in his life and found them neither exciting nor troubling, just necessary. There was a line near the bottom that said, "I am aware these arrangements may not be the preferred manner of introduction, and I offer my word that Miss Voss's comfort and opinion will be given full consideration in all matters following the initial formalization. All matters following the initial formalization, which meant, after the decision was already made, Mara folded the letter along its original crease. She placed it back beside the butter dish. She drank her tea, which had gone slightly cool. "I assume," she said, "that father has already replied." Her mother's hands tightened on the cup. "He has expressed interest in proceeding." "Yes," Mara said. "I thought so." She stood, picked up the ledger she had brought to the table, and tucked it under her arm. Took one more sip of her tea. "I will be in the garden," she said. She was not in the garden. She went to the garden gate, opened it, stood on the lane beyond it for a moment, with the morning air on her face, and then she walked. Not anywhere in particular. Just away from the table and the butter dish and the careful way her mother had placed a letter about her life next to the silverware, without telling her it was coming. The lane ran between two fields. One of them belonged to the Voss estate, or had belonged, which was a distinction that mattered in ways Mara did not allow herself to examine too carefully. The other belonged to old Mr. Hatch, who grew barley and did not borrow money from banks, and whose family had not owned 3 villages or forest land, but who also had not, as far as she knew, ever needed to sell his daughter's future to cover his debts. She walked until the house was out of sight, until the only sounds were the birds in the hedge and her own feet on the dry lane, and the occasional soft complaint of the wind in the elm trees at the field's edge. Then she sat down on the stone wall at the corner where the lane turned, and she looked at the barley field, which was very green and very ordinary, and very unbothered by any of this, and she thought, her family's situation was not a secret, not from her. She had been doing the accounts since she was 19, when it became clear that her father's attention moved toward problems he could talk about, rather than problems he could solve, and someone needed to know the actual numbers. The numbers were bad. Not catastrophically bad, not yet, but the direction was clear. The way a road heading downhill is clear even when you are still near the top. The estate needed income. The estate needed maintenance it was not receiving. The gardener had been the first casualty. The second had been the second horse. The third was going to be the eastern fence, which Mara had noted in the ledger under deferred repairs for the second winter running. She understood, with the clarity that comes from years of understanding things that no one asked her to understand, that the letter was not a surprise. It was the outcome of the numbers. Her father had found a way to make the numbers work, which was the only kind of problem he was genuinely good at solving, and the solution had her name on it. What she felt about this was complicated, in the way that things are complicated when you understand them too well to pretend otherwise. She was not a fool. She knew that marriages were made for reasons that had very little to do with preference, especially for women in families like hers, especially in places like Hartwell, where the social contract was old and dense, and had no patience for sentiment when land was at stake. She had known for years, in the quiet back part of her mind where she kept the things she did not discuss, that some version of this was likely. A letter, a decision made in February while she was doing the accounts. What she had not expected was the butter dish. The staging of it. The way her mother had placed the letter there, as though its arrival were a natural thing, a thing that simply happened to families like theirs, like weather, like harvest, not a thing that her father had engineered across 3 months of correspondence with a man she had never met. Lord Aldrich Vane of Crestmore. She tried the name out in her mind. It did not produce any particular feeling. It was a name like other names, 4 syllables with a title in front of them. She knew nothing about him, except what the letter said, which was essentially that he existed, that he had land, and that he was willing to proceed. These were not qualities. They were facts. They told her nothing about whether he was kind or cruel, patient or quick-tempered, whether he laughed at things that were funny, or at things that were not, whether he was the sort of man who explained things to women as though women were children, or the sort who simply talked to you like you were a person in the room. She had met men of both varieties. The first kind was more common. She stayed on the wall for a long time. The barley field did not offer any opinions. The elm trees rustled without comment. A crow landed on the fence post at the far end of the wall and looked at her with the frank, unsentimental gaze of a creature that has no investment in the outcome of her problems, which she found, on balance, more comfortable than the gaze of anyone currently in her house. When she finally stood and walked back, the gate was still open where she had left it. The garden needed weeding. The accounts were not going to finish themselves. And the letter, she knew, was still on the table beside the butter dish, waiting for her to return to it and decide what kind of woman she was going to be about this. She had not decided yet, but she had the ledger under her arm, and she was going to finish the accounts first, because the accounts were real, and the numbers were honest, and when everything else felt like it was arranged by other people without her knowledge, there was something steady about a column of figures that added up to what they added up to, regardless of what anyone had planned. Her father was in the study when she came back through the front door. She could hear him moving behind the closed door, the particular shuffle of a man rearranging himself when he heard footsteps, the sound of someone composing his expression before a conversation he knows is coming. She walked past the door without knocking. That, she decided, was also a choice. Dinner that evening was quiet, in the specific way that dinners are quiet when everyone at the table is waiting for someone else to begin a conversation that no one wants to be the one to start. Edmund Voss cut his meat with the focused attention of a man who has decided that his plate is the most interesting thing in the room. Clara kept her eyes on her glass, refilling it with water she did not drink. Lotte, who was 21, and optimistic in the resilient way of people who have not yet had enough, go wrong to discourage them, attempted twice to introduce a topic, once about a neighbor's new horse, once about a book she had read. Both attempts sank without reaching the other side of the table. Mara ate her dinner. She was good at this, at sitting in rooms where the weight of an unsaid thing pressed down on the ceiling, and the candles burned and everyone breathed around the subject rather than through it. She had grown up in this house. She had eaten a great many dinners in this specific quality of silence. She was halfway through her meal when her father set down his fork. "I imagine your mother spoke with you this morning," he said, to his plate rather than to her. "She did," Mara said. Lord Vane is a man of considerable reputation. He has managed the northern estates with— "I read the letter," Mara said. Her father looked up. He had the look of a man who had prepared for a longer runway. "Yes. Well, then you know the substance of the arrangement." "I know the substance of your decision," she said. "They are not quite the same thing." A pause. Edmund Voss was not an unkind man. This was the difficult part, the part she had spent years navigating. The fact that her father was not cruel, not cold, not indifferent. He loved her in the distracted, half-articulate way that some men love their daughters, as a fact of life they are grateful for, and do not examine closely. He was simply a man who solved problems by moving pieces around the board, and sometimes the pieces were people, and he did not always notice that the pieces had feelings about being moved. "Mara," he said, quietly. "The estate." "I know about the estate," she said. "I do the accounts." He was silent for a moment. Clara looked at her water glass. Lotte had stopped eating entirely. "Then you know," her father said, finally, "that something must change." "Yes," Mara said, "I know that." And that was all she said, because she did know, and because she was not willing, at this particular table, on this particular Tuesday, to pretend that knowing something, and accepting it gracefully, were the same thing. There was a difference between understanding a situation and surrendering to it without a word, and she was not ready to surrender yet, not to the butter dish, not to the letter, not to the particular silence that had just swallowed her father's voice and left her mother looking at water she would not drink. She finished her dinner. She said goodnight to all three of them. She went upstairs, took the ledger from her desk, and finished the accounts by lamplight. The numbers were what they were. They did not change to accommodate her feelings. In this way they were more honest than almost everything else in the house, and she was grateful for them. And she worked until the lamp began to gutter, and then she closed the ledger and lay in the dark, and listened to the house settle around her. And she thought about a man she had never met, and a letter that had arrived on a Tuesday, and 4 months of her life that had apparently been decided in February, while she was keeping the books. She did not feel afraid. Fear was for things that were uncertain. She felt something older and quieter than fear. She felt the particular weight of a woman who has always known what was coming and has now watched it arrive. The crow from the field wall would have understood. Everything else in her life seemed constitutionally unable to. She closed her eyes. Outside, the night was clear and cool, and the elm trees stood in it, without needing anything from anyone, which struck her, even now, even in the dark, as a reasonable way to be. In 3 weeks' time, her mother told her, Lord Vane would write again. With a proposed date, everything was moving forward, everything was being arranged. Mara pulled the blanket up and looked at the ceiling and said nothing to it, and the ceiling said nothing back, and between the two of them, they managed the rest of the night without any particular drama, which was, she thought, about as much as you could ask for. The village of Hartwell did not wait for an invitation to form an opinion. By Thursday, which was 2 days after the letter, and 5 days before anyone had told anyone anything official, the general shape of the story had already moved from house to house, like a thing with its own legs, picking up details as it went that no one could have known, because they had not happened yet. Mrs. Pole, at the dry goods shop, had it on good authority from someone whose cousin worked for a family that corresponded with the northern estates that Lord Vane was extraordinarily tall, taller than any man in the county, and that his family's history went back so far that they had documents about it. The schoolmaster's wife, a woman named Harriet George who collected information the way other people collected china, confirmed the height and added that he had dark hair and the kind of bearing that made other men straighten their backs when he entered a room. The miller's daughter, who was 17 and in the middle of reading her second novel, contributed that he was rumored to have once declined a position at court because he found cities morally exhausting, which she considered the most romantic thing she had ever heard. None of these people had met Lord Vane. None of them had seen a portrait. The information was built entirely from the architecture of hope and the very basic human impulse to make a story complete, even when half the pieces are missing. Mara heard all of it, because Hartwell was not large, and she walked through it regularly, and because people in small places say things in voices calibrated for a room, not for a street, and sound carries. She did not correct any of it. Correction required engagement, and engagement required caring about the accuracy of a portrait being assembled by people who had never seen the subject. She was not sure she cared yet. She was still working on caring about the original letter, which was still beside the butter dish in her mind, which was where it had taken up permanent residence, like furniture, that had been placed slightly wrong, and could not be shifted without rearranging the whole room. Her cousin Lotte cared enormously. Lotte Voss was the daughter of Edmund's younger brother, a cheerful man who had moved to the coast and made a modest but comfortable living in trade, and had consequently raised a daughter who was optimistic in the way of people for whom things have generally worked out. She was visiting for the season, which meant she was staying in the yellow bedroom and eating breakfast at the family table, and accompanying Mara on walks through the village, with the faithful energy of someone who is genuinely glad to be wherever she is. He turned down a position at court, Lotte said, walking beside Mara along the high street on Friday morning, 2 days after the miller's daughter had contributed this fact to the collective portrait. That says something about a person, don't you think? A person who turns down something like that for his own reasons? It says he had reasons, Mara said. It doesn't say what they were. No, but it says he has principles. A man without principles doesn't turn things down. He takes everything offered and asks for more. Mara looked at the baker's window as they passed. The bread looked good. She considered stopping for a roll and decided against it, because stopping would mean standing still in the high street, and standing still in the high street meant being visible, and being visible today meant being the subject of the thing everyone in Hartwell was currently talking about. Harriet George says he is tall, Lotte continued, in the particular tone of someone presenting evidence. Taller than his solicitor, she said. And his solicitor is already a tall man. And she said he has... Lotte. Yes? Harriet George has never seen him. Lotte was quiet for a moment, but only a moment, because she was Lotte, and she recovered from interruptions like a plant recovering from a gust of wind. She has corresponded with someone who has. Corresponded, Mara said. Written letters to. I know what it means. Lotte tilted her head slightly. You are not curious at all. Not even a little. I am curious about many things, Mara said. I am curious about the eastern fence, and whether the estimate for repairs is accurate. I am curious about whether the grocer is going to extend my father's credit again, or whether this is the season he finally decides not to. I am curious about... You are curious about things that are not him, Lotte said, with the gentle accuracy of someone who knows you well enough to notice what you are avoiding. Mara did not answer this immediately. They walked past the post office, past the narrow alley beside it where the doctor kept his surgery, past the old pump that no one used since the well was dug, but that stood in the square like a civic ornament, a reminder of something the village had needed once and had improved past. "I am trying," Mara said finally, "to be sensible about it." And what does sensible mean in this context? It means not building a picture of a person from other people's guesses, and then being surprised when the picture doesn't match. Lotte considered this with the serious expression she wore when she was giving an idea more credit than she privately intended to. "But you have to feel something. You are going to marry him."
I know that.
"So feel something." "I am feeling many things," Mara said. "I am feeling them privately, which is where I prefer to feel things." Lotte opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sometimes I think you are the most contained person I have ever met." "Thank you," Mara said. "I did not intend it as a compliment." "I know," Mara said. "I received it as one anyway." They walked on. The morning was bright, and the air still had the coolness of spring, before it became summer's heat, and the high street was doing the ordinary things of a Friday morning, the baker sweeping his step, the carter unloading at the inn, the school children crossing at the corner with the distracted energy of people who have somewhere to be, and no particular feeling about being there. It was all very ordinary. Mara was grateful for ordinary. Ordinary was something you could hold on to when everything else was being arranged by other people. They were turning to go back when Mrs. Pole came out of the dry goods shop. Mrs. Pole was 62, and had lived in Hartwell for all 62 years, and had therefore been present for most of its significant events, and had opinions about all of them. She was a small woman, who moved with the decisive efficiency of someone who has no time to waste, and has never had time to waste, and intends to continue not wasting it. She saw Mara and Lotte from 10 feet away, altered her trajectory, and intercepted them with the smooth inevitability of a river reaching the sea. "Miss Voss," she said, with a warmth that had business under it. "And Miss Lotte, how lovely." "Good morning, Mrs. Pole," Mara said. "I was very pleased to hear your news," Mrs. Pole said, with the tone of someone who had been pleased about it privately for 2 days, and was now pleased about it out loud. "Lord Vane is, by all accounts, a man of real substance. Not one of these younger sons with ideas above what they can afford. A real establishment." "We know very little about him as yet," Mara said pleasantly. Of course. But one hears things. And what one hears is very reassuring. The northern properties have been well managed for years, not like some we could name." A meaningful pause, in which several local families were silently gestured to. "Your father must be very pleased." "My father is pleased about many things," Mara said, which was true without being an answer. Mrs. Pole looked at her, with the X-ray attention of a woman who has spent 60 years reading between lines. "And you, my dear, how are you feeling about it?" "I feel very well, thank you," Mara said. "The morning is particularly nice." Mrs. Pole's expression shifted a fraction of an inch, toward something that acknowledged the deflection and respected it slightly more than it had expected to. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it is a fine morning." A pause. "He will be coming for the wedding, I assume. Not far. Will he come down before?" "The details are still being arranged," Mara said. "Of course. Well." Mrs. Pole straightened slightly, as people do when they have obtained as much as they are going to obtain from a conversation, and are preparing to move on. "You must let me know if there is anything I can do. The village does so want to be supportive." "That is very kind," Mara said. "Good morning, Mrs. Pole." They walked away. When they had rounded the corner, Lotte leaned slightly toward her and said, in a voice that was trying to be quiet but was not quite, "She is going to tell the whole street what you said." "I said almost nothing," Mara pointed out. "Exactly. That is news in itself." The house was quieter when they returned than when they had left it, which was unusual, and which meant, Mara knew before she had even taken her coat off, that something had happened while she was out. The particular silence of the Voss house had its own vocabulary. There was the silence of an ordinary morning, which was one thing. There was the silence of her father in his study, after he had done something he was uncertain about, which was another. And there was this silence, the one she found when she stepped through the door, and hung her coat on the hook, and stood in the hall with her hand still on the peg. This was the third kind. Her mother appeared from the sitting room. She had the look of a woman who has just received news and is in the process of deciding what to do with her face about it. There was another letter, Clara said. Mara waited. From Lord Vane, a second letter. He wrote directly this time. To you. Mara looked at her mother. And where is it? On the table, Clara said. I put it with the butter dish, Mara said. Yes. She went into the dining room. The table was set for nothing in particular. That odd in-between state of a table that has been cleared after breakfast and not yet laid for anything else. The letter sat on it, alone this time, without the butter dish, which had been moved to the sideboard. Perhaps her mother had understood. Perhaps she had simply needed the sideboard for something. Mara picked up the letter. It was addressed to her, her name in that same steady, unhurried hand, Miss Mara Elaine Voss. The formality of the full name, the way it sat on the envelope with a kind of deliberateness, as though he had chosen each part of it carefully and set it down on purpose. She opened it at the table, standing, because sitting felt too ceremonial for a letter from a stranger. It was not long, 3 paragraphs. The first was formal, an acknowledgement that the initial agreement had been communicated, and an expression of hope that the terms had been satisfactorily explained. The second was slightly less formal, a sentence or two about the northern estate and the season there, and the fact that it had been a late spring in the hills, the kind of late spring where the frost comes back twice after you think it is done. The third was short. It said, I am aware that this situation is not of your choosing in the usual sense. I do not consider that a small thing. If you have questions or concerns that you would prefer to address directly and privately, you may write to me. I will answer honestly. She read the third paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and held it for a moment, not reading it anymore, just holding it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, which was slight. It was paper. It was nothing, and yet it sat in her palms, with more substance than the first letter had managed in all its formal arrangement of words. I will answer honestly. She thought about that for a long time, about the specific nature of that sentence, its smallness, its directness, the fact that he had not said, I will answer fully, or I will explain everything, or I will assure you that all will be well. He had said he would answer honestly, which was a different promise, a smaller one and a harder one. She put the letter in the pocket of her dress. She went to the window. Outside, the garden still needed weeding, the eastern fence was still in the ledger under deferred repairs, and the village of Hartwell was still assembling a picture of a man it had never seen from the raw materials of hope and other people's letters. But in her pocket was a letter from the man himself, not from his solicitor, not from her father's arrangements, from him. And he had said he would answer honestly. She did not write back that day. She did not write back that week. She was not avoiding it. She was thinking about what she wanted to know, which was a different thing from knowing what to ask, and she had learned long ago that there was no point rushing the distance between those two things. The question you send is the one that gets answered. You only get to send it once. She wanted it to be the right one. Her cousin Lotte asked her every morning for 6 days whether she had written yet. Every morning Mara said no. By the 6th day Lotte had moved from asking to sighing, which was progress of a kind, and which Mara acknowledged by ignoring with the comfortable expertise of a woman who had been managing Lotte's sighs for most of both their lives. On the 7th day, she sat at her desk and wrote. Not a long letter. She was not a woman who wrote long letters when short ones would do. She wrote 3 sentences after the formalities. She wrote, You said you would answer honestly. I would like to know one thing only, for now. Why the arrangement? Not why a marriage in general, but why this one, arranged this way, without meeting. What did you expect to learn from a woman who had no choice about meeting you? She sealed it before she could revise it. She sent it with the Monday post. And then she waited, which she was good at, and she did the accounts, which she was good at, and she listened to Hartwell build its picture of a man in the north, who had dark hair, and was taller than his solicitor, and had turned down a position at court for his own reasons, and she thought about honestly, and what that word cost to mean, and whether he would find that it cost him anything at all. The wedding morning came in like any other morning. That was the first betrayal. Mara had expected something from the day itself, some signal, some quality of the light or the air that would mark it as different from all the mornings before it. Instead, the sun came through her curtains the same way it always came. The birds in the garden made the same complaints they always made, and the house smelled of bread and beeswax, and the faint underlayer of old stone that it always smelled of. Nothing about the morning understood what it was. She dressed herself. Her mother had offered 3 times, Lotta had offered twice. The woman from the village who helped with alterations had offered once, and then retreated, with the diplomacy of someone reading the room correctly. Mara thanked all of them and dressed herself, because that was at least one thing she could do on her own today, and she intended to begin and end the list of things done on her own today, at as many entries as it could hold. The dress was simple. Not poor, but not excessive. Her mother had wanted more fabric, more detail, more of the elaborate stitching that would say to everyone present that the Voss family were not people who had needed to let the gardener go. Mara had been firm. She had been firm in the particular way she was firm about things, which was quiet and consistent and completely impenetrable to argument, which her mother had discovered somewhere around the 3rd conversation and had given up on by the 4th. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. The reflection was matter-of-fact about her. Dark hair pinned neatly, pale dress, eyes that her father called gray and her mother called hazel, and Lotta called interesting, which was what people said when they did not want to commit to a color. She was not a woman who spent time deciding how she looked. She looked how she looked. The Mirror reported this without editorializing, which was one of its better qualities. She picked up her gloves, set them down, picked them up again. In 6 weeks, she had received 2 more letters from Lord Vane. The first had been an answer to her question, and it had been exactly what he promised. Honest. Not diplomatic, not careful, not the kind of answer that fills space without giving anything. He had written, "The arrangement was my idea, not your father's solicitors, though they accommodated it willingly enough. I have had the experience of meeting women who were introduced to me as potential matches in the usual way, at dinners and assemblies and country weekends, and I found that both parties spend the entire meeting performing for an audience. I could not learn anything real about anyone that way. I thought there might be something to be learned by beginning with honesty about what the situation is, instead of pretending we had met by accident and were simply getting acquainted. I may have been wrong, but I meant it honestly." She had read that letter 4 times. Not because it was unclear, but because it kept revealing something slightly different each time, the way a room reveals itself differently depending on where you stand in it. He had written the second letter without waiting for a reply to the first. It arrived 10 days later, and was shorter, and said simply, "I am aware I may have been too direct. If I have made the situation more difficult rather than less, I apologize. That was not the intent. But I would like to know what you thought of the answer, if you are willing to say." She had written back. She had said, "I did not find it too direct. I found it more respectful than the alternative. I am still thinking about what it means." He had not replied after that. Not yet. The wedding was in 2 days from when she had sent that last letter, and the post from the north was not always fast, and she was standing at her washstand holding her gloves, and thinking about a man she had never seen, whose handwriting was even and unhurried, and who had said he meant it honestly. Mara, her mother at the door. Soft knock, softer voice. "Yes," Mara said. "I am ready." She was not ready. But she put her gloves on, which was close enough to ready to serve the same purpose, and she opened the door, and her mother's face did something complicated when she saw her, something that moved through 6 or 7 different feelings in the span of 2 seconds, before settling on an expression that was mostly love, with a very thin border of guilt around it. "You look beautiful," Clara said. "Thank you, Mother." They looked at each other. There was a great deal unsaid between them, and would remain unsaid, because some things are said and some things are simply known and lived with, and this was a family that had learned which was which. "He will be good to you," Clara said. "I believe that." Mara looked at her mother's hands, which were clasped together in front of her, with the whitened knuckles of someone holding themselves very still. "I know you believe it," she said. "That is not nothing." Clara's eyes went bright. "It is not what I would have chosen, if I could have." "Mother," Mara said, gently, "we should go down." They went down. The church was 6 minutes by foot from the house, which Mara had always thought was one of Hartwell's better features. She had walked to it hundreds of times. She walked to it now through the village lane with her mother on one side and Lotta on the other, and the morning was bright and clean and completely indifferent to her in the way that only mornings can be, and she walked with her eyes forward and her pace even, and the whole of Hartwell, it seemed, had found a reason to be outdoors. They were not rude about it. The village was not rude. They watched the way a crowd watches something it is invested in, with a warmth that was genuine, and a curiosity that was equally genuine, and that managed to be both of these things at once, without being either one exclusively. There were nods, small waves, the soft sound of good wishes passed between neighbors. Mrs. Pole stood on her step, with her hands clasped, and nodded with an air of deep satisfaction, as though the whole arrangement had been her idea. The church door was open. Light came through it, and fell on the stone path, and from inside came the murmur of voices and the smell of the flowers that Lotta and 3 of the neighbor women had arranged yesterday, with a thoroughness that suggested they had taken the decorating very personally. Mara stopped on the path. Not from hesitation, or not purely from hesitation. She stopped because the moment asked for a stop, because there is a thing that happens at the threshold of irreversible events, where the body understands something the mind is still catching up to, and the body says, "One more second, just one more. Not of this, not of what you are leaving, but of what it is to be in the space before the thing happens rather than after." She stood on the path and breathed, and looked at the open door, and the light in it. Lotta's hand found her arm, not gripping, just present. Then Mara walked forward, and the light received her, and she went in. The church was full. She had not expected quite how full. Every family in the village, it seemed, and several she recognized from neighboring estates, and her father's connections from the county, all assembled in the wooden pews with their good clothes, and their collected attention aimed at the front, where the officiant stood, with his book open, and his expression arranged for the occasion. She walked down the aisle and did not look at faces. This was deliberate. If she looked at faces, she would read them, and if she read them, she would start cataloging them the way she cataloged everything, noting which ones were warm and which were curious, and which were performing a feeling they did not entirely have, and she did not have room for all of that right now. She looked at the front of the church, at the dark wood of the old carved altar rail, and the light from the side window that fell on it, in a long, slanted stripe. She reached the front, and stopped, because the space beside the officiant was empty. No, not empty. The officiant was there, his book open, his face doing the complicated thing that faces do when something unexpected is happening, and they are calculating how visibly to react. And there were flowers, Lotta's flowers, too many flowers. It was really an excessive number of flowers. And there were witnesses and guests, and the murmur of the full church behind her. But the man was not there. She stood at the front of the church, facing forward, and heard behind her the slow, strange shift in sound that a crowd makes when it moves from expectancy to confusion. The murmur changed, became a different kind of murmur, lower, with more texture, a sound made by people exchanging looks with each other, and then looking at her. Then it started, not from the door, but from the windows on the north side of the church, where several children had arranged themselves on the sill ledges, as children do at any event where there is a view worth having. One of them laughed first, a high, bright sound that bounced off the stone ceiling and scattered through the church like something dropped. Then another. And then, from the windows, then from the pew nearest the window, then spreading back and inward like a wave that follows its own logic, came the laughter. And with it came the sound she had not recognized at first, because she had never heard a sound quite like it. The sound of a horse-drawn vehicle on cobblestones that was not the sound she had been told to expect. Not the sound of a lacquered carriage with brass fixtures and matched horses. A different sound, slower, wooden. The patient, unhurried creak of a working vehicle, built for moving things from one field to another, pulling into the churchyard. She did not turn, not yet. She heard the creak of the wooden gate. She heard the sound of boots on stone. She heard the laughter in the church swell. Not all of it unkind, but all of it unanimous. A sound too big for any single thing it was aimed at. Then the door at the back of the church opened. Mara turned. He was tall. That part was true. The part that Harriet George had insisted on. The part that had survived even the elaborate process of transmission and embellishment that village gossip applied to everything. He was taller than she had pictured, and she had tried not to picture anything, which meant she had pictured something, and it had not been this. He wore a plain wool coat, not a wedding coat, not the formal dress of a man attending his own wedding as a social event. A good coat, well made, but working wool, the kind of coat a landowner wears to walk his land in the morning. His boots were clean but not polished to ceremony. He held his own hat in his hand, and had evidently driven the cart himself, because there was no coachman behind him, and his hands had the easy, unthinking grip of a man who is used to holding reins. He walked down the aisle, and he did not look at the congregation. He looked at her. The laughter was still happening around them, behind them, above them, somewhere in the stone arches. She heard it. She understood that she was supposed to feel something particular about it, that the situation was designed, by its very nature, to produce a specific feeling in her, the feeling of humiliation by association, of having arrived expecting one thing and received another in front of everyone she knew. She looked at the man walking toward her. His face was ordinary in the way that solid, useful things are ordinary. Not the face the miller's daughter had assembled from novels, not cathedral tall and verdict-jawed, but there was something in it that held still, while everything around it was moving, a stillness that was not cold, not guarded, not arranged, just there, steady, the way a fixed point is steady when everything around it turns. He reached the front, stopped beside her, looked at her with dark eyes that did not apologize, and did not perform, and did not ask her to pretend she was not confused. Behind them, the laughter was settling, the way laughter does when it has nothing new to feed it, and begins to become aware of itself. She heard Mrs. Pole, distinctly, say something to her neighbor, in the third pew, that was too quiet to make out, but that had the shape of a judgment. She heard Lotta, behind her, draw a breath. She did not look away from him. He said nothing, which was, she thought, the correct instinct. There was nothing to say right now that would not be wrong in one direction or another, too much or too little, and he seemed to understand that, seemed to feel the particular geometry of this moment, and he simply stood in it, in the laughter and the flowers and the too-full church, and the weight of everyone looking, and he was still. The officiant cleared his throat. And Mara Voss, daughter of Edmund Voss of Hartwell, who had spent 6 weeks thinking about a word, decided in that moment to move one more word to the front of the list. Present. She would be present, whatever else this was. She faced the front of the church. The laughter died. The officiant began. He helped her into the cart himself. Not a footman, not a groomsman, not anyone employed for the specific ceremonial purpose of helping brides into vehicles. Him. He had walked out of the church ahead of her, which was not how these things were usually done, and had positioned himself at the side of the cart, and turned, and offered his hand, with the particular directness of a man who has thought about a thing and decided to do it, rather than waiting to see what ceremony expected. She took his hand. His grip was certain. That was the first thing she noticed, and it was the thing that stayed with her longest after, the specific quality of certain. Not strong in the demonstrative way of men who want you to notice their strength, certain in the way of hands that know what they are doing, that close around what they hold with calibration rather than effort, fingers placed with the assurance of someone who has caught falling things before and knows exactly how much force is needed and does not use a fraction more. She stepped up onto the cart, sat on the wooden bench beside him. The bench was worn smooth in a way that took years to happen, not a decorative thing but a useful thing made comfortable by use. The cart moved. Behind them, through the arch of the churchyard gate, the wedding guests streamed out of the church and arranged themselves in the complex social geometry of people who have witnessed something they are not sure how to classify. She did not look back at them. She was looking at the lane ahead, at the 2 brown horses pulling the cart with the patient, rhythmic efficiency of animals that have been doing their work long enough that it requires no particular attention from them. They did not speak for the first several minutes. The cart made its wooden sound on the lane, and the morning moved around them. And beside her, the man who was now her husband sat with his hands easy on the reins and said nothing. She was taking inventory. Not of him. Not exactly. Not the way you inventory a person directly. More the way you know a room you have entered for the first time, not by staring at everything in it, but by letting your eyes rest where they naturally rest, and noting what they find there. His hands. She kept returning to his hands. They held the reins the way you hold something familiar, not gripping, not performing, the loose, competent grip of someone who has held reins for years and has stopped needing to think about it. These were not hands that held things occasionally. They were hands that held things. He smelled of wood smoke, and something under it, faint but present, something that did not belong to wood smoke, or to wool, or to the particular smell of the cart and the horses and the spring morning. Something she could not name. She did not try to name it. She filed it under evidence and moved on. "There is a road around the east side of the hill," he said finally. "It is longer, but the view of the valley is worth it if you are not in a hurry to arrive." She considered that. The phrase, "if you are not in a hurry to arrive," said to a woman being driven to a house she had never seen, for a life she had not chosen, by a man she had not met until an hour ago. "I am not in any particular hurry," she said. He turned the horses east. The road went up slightly, through an old oak wood that had been there long enough that the roots had swallowed the stone walls beside the lane and were in the process of a very slow argument with them. Then it came out of the wood onto a ridge, and the valley opened below them, wide and green, a broad sweep of farmed land and hedgerow, and the silver thread of a river cutting through it, and beyond that, the hills on the other side folding up blue and soft against the sky. She looked at it. It was, as advertised, worth seeing. "This is not your land," she said. "No," he said. "This section belongs to the Hardwick estate. The southern edge of my land begins down there, just past the second tree line." She looked where he indicated, "And the farmhouse is within your land. At the center of it, more or less. A quarter of an hour from here, by this road." She thought about that. A quarter of an hour by road. They were quiet again, but the quality of the quiet had changed slightly, the way quiet changes when two people have established that they can speak to each other, and have chosen to return to silence rather than been forced into it. It was a slightly more comfortable silence than the one before. Not comfortable exactly, but less pressured. "I received your last letter the day before yesterday," he said. There was not time to reply. "I know," she said. "The post from the north is not reliable for timing." A pause. Then, "You said you were still thinking about what it meant. My answer to your question. What did you conclude?" She had not expected him to continue the conversation from the letters, as though there had been no ceremony in between, as though the church and the cart and the laughter and the whole elaborate interruption of the ordinary thing they had been building in correspondence were simply a brief suspension of something they were in the middle of. She found, unexpectedly, that she did not mind. "I concluded," she said, "that you had thought about this more carefully than most people think about arrangements of this kind. Whether that thinking arrived at the right answer is a different question." "And what question did you want it to answer?" "Whether it was about your preference or about mine." He was quiet for a moment. The cart went down the far side of the ridge and entered a lane between hedges. "It was primarily about mine," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise. I preferred this method. I am aware that my preference carried more weight in the arrangement than yours did. That is not something I can change now, but I want to be honest that I am aware of it." She looked at the hedges. "You keep using that word," she said. "Which word?" "Honest." "Yes," he said. "I have found that I say it often when I am in a situation where I am uncertain what else to offer." The lane turned. The farmhouse appeared ahead, tucked into a fold in the land as though it had grown there, rather than been built. Stone walls the same color as the lane and the field walls around it. A vegetable garden on the south side, with the practical untidy abundance of a garden that is maintained for use rather than appearance. A barn beside it, where the outline of a third horse was visible through the open door. She looked at it. "It is a real farm," she said. "Yes," he said. "You actually work it." "Yes. You chose this." He brought the cart to a stop at the gate. The horses settled with the relief of animals that have arrived at a known destination. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since the church, not the glancing assessments they had been making of each other on the cart, but a direct, full look, steady and unguarded. "I chose it," he said. "Yes." She looked back at him. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read quickly, not because it concealed things deliberately, but because it did not perform them. Most people's faces ran slightly ahead of what they were thinking, giving you the preview before the thought finished forming. His ran at exactly the same speed as whatever was behind it, which meant you had to look at it longer to get the same amount of information, and most people were not used to looking at faces that long, and became uncomfortable and looked away. She did not look away. Why? She asked. He understood the question. She could see that he understood it, that it did not require explanation or narrowing. Because I wanted to know what I was, without what I have, he said. There is a difficulty, with land and title, in knowing what people see when they look at you. Whether they see the person or the position. I found I could not tell anymore. I came here 4 years ago for a season, and I have not gone back. She thought about that. And now you have brought a wife here, she said, who did not know what you were until an hour ago. Yes. So you have introduced a different difficulty. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, but the approach of one, the territory just before. Yes, he said. I think I may have. She looked at the farmhouse, the vegetable garden, the barn with its practical outline. All of it real, all of it used, all of it without pretension or staging. I grew up keeping accounts for a house whose debt my father described as temporary difficulties, she said. So I am not entirely without experience of the distance between what a situation appears to be and what it is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he got down from the cart and came around to her side and offered his hand again. She took it and stepped down. Her feet found the lane, and she stood in it and looked at the house and the lane and the field and the pale afternoon sky above all of it. He was still holding her hand, not gripping it, just holding it, with that same certain quality, as though it had simply not occurred to him to let go. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. A name, she said. I would like to use your name, not your title. He looked at her. Aldrich, he said. Mara, she said. He nodded once. Then he let go of her hand and opened the gate. She walked through it, into the yard of the farmhouse, onto the stones of a life that was already different from every version of it she had tried to imagine, and she heard the gate close behind her, and the sound it made was solid and unhurried, a gate that knew its own weight. Inside, the house smelled of wood and old stone, and something cooking on the range, and someone had placed a jar of early flowers on the table in the kitchen, the kind of gesture that is both small and enormous, depending on how you look at it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she put her gloves on the table beside the flowers. The afternoon was warm. The vegetable garden wanted attention she could see even from the window. The accounts of this place, whatever they were, would need to be looked at. There was a great deal she did not know, and a great deal she would need to learn, and she was good at learning things that mattered, which she had also known without being told, which was perhaps the thing that had made her useful to a household that could not afford to be looked after by someone who was not paying attention. She paid attention to his hands and his voice, and the way he had said 4 years ago like it was a fact that had not yet finished meaning something to him, to the jar of flowers that someone, him presumably, had placed on the table before driving a cart to his own wedding in a plain wool coat, to the door at the end of the kitchen hallway. Dark wood, a lock that was finer than the rest of the fittings in the farmhouse, slightly out of register with everything around it, the way something is out of register when it belongs to a different version of a place than the version currently on display. She looked at it, then looked away. There was a time for everything, and this was not the time for that. She asked him where the kettle was. He told her. She put it on. They had their tea at the kitchen table, in the afternoon light, in the particular silence of two people who are beginning to be in the same room, rather than simply occupying it at the same time, and the sound of the kettle, and the sound of the cups, and the sound of the farm outside the window were all the same as they would have been on any other afternoon, and yet they were not, and she noticed that too, the way she noticed everything, quietly and without announcing it, filing it away in the place where she kept the things that would matter later. He asked her if she was tired. She said a little. He showed her where the rooms were. Hers was the larger of the two upstairs rooms, a room that smelled of beeswax, and had a window looking south over the garden and the valley beyond. She stood at the window for a long time after he had gone back downstairs. The valley in the late afternoon was a different thing from the valley in the morning, the light on the hills going copper, and the shadows of the trees reaching longer across the fields. It was very beautiful, in a way she had not been prepared to find it, this view from a window of a farmhouse she had not known she would be standing in. Outside, she could hear him moving in the yard, the sound of his boots on the stones, the patient, ordinary sounds of a man doing the afternoon work of a farm. She could hear it. That was something. Not everything, not nearly everything, but something. She could hear him, and the sound he made was ordinary and real and present, and she stood at the window of her new room in her new life, and the valley went copper in the late light, and she thought that of all the things she had expected today to feel like, this particular feeling was not among them. She did not have a word for it yet. She was looking for one. She found the farm's books on the third morning. Not that she was looking for them. She was looking for a place to put the jar of early flowers, which had wilted and needed emptying, and she opened the wrong cabinet in the kitchen, and found instead of an empty shelf, a set of ledger books, so well kept, that she stood with the wilted flowers in her hand, and stared at them for longer than the situation required. They were organized by year and by category. The handwriting in them was not Aldrich's, or not entirely his. There were two different hands, one older and one newer, and the newer one, his, was identical to the handwriting of his letters. The categories were precise and practical: field yields, livestock costs, repairs, provisions, labor, and at the back of each year's book, a summary page with the annual balance stated plainly, not dressed up, not smoothed over, just the number. The numbers were good. Not wealthy good, not estate good, but real good. The goodness of a farm that was managed by someone who understood the relationship between what went in and what came out, and did not spend more of one than the other. She recognized it immediately. It was the same quality she tried to bring to her father's accounts, the ones she had been keeping for 4 years, and never quite achieved, because her father's accounts had a category she could not account for, called My Father's Decisions, which were neither consistent nor predictable, and which had a way of disrupting any calculation she had built. These books had no such category. She put the wilted flowers in her other hand, and stood there with a ledger book held open, and felt something in her chest that was strange and almost embarrassing to identify. It was something adjacent to relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying a thing alone for a very long time and has just walked into a room and found someone who knows how to carry things and has been carrying them, carefully and competently, without anyone making a performance of it. She put the ledger back, closed the cabinet, went and dealt with the flowers. The farm had a rhythm, she learned, and it was not trying to hide that rhythm from her. The rhythm was simply already there, established by the seasons and the animals and the work they required, and it did not stop or reorganize itself to accommodate her arrival. It continued, and she was either going to stand outside it or step into it, and standing outside things was not, on balance, a habit she had ever managed to sustain. She began with the garden on the 4th day. The vegetable garden on the south side, the one she had seen from the cart, the one that needed attention in the visible, specific, impatient way that vegetable gardens need attention in spring when the weeds are getting ambitious. She put on the oldest dress she had brought with her and found a pair of gloves in the hook by the back door that were too large but serviceable, and she went out and she got to work. The neighbor found her there an hour later. He came over the low stone wall from the adjacent property, which she would discover was his habitual entrance and exit from the Vane land, because the wall was lower there, and the actual gate was farther along, and he had decided some years ago that the wall was more efficient. He was a man of about 60, solid and sun-weathered, with the kind of face that had stopped caring what it looked like at some point in middle age, and was now simply functional. He stopped on the Vane side of the wall, and looked at her with the frank curiosity of a man in the country who has no reason to disguise his interest. "You're the new wife," he said, not unkindly, just as a statement. Apparently, she said, she did not stop weeding. He seemed to find this satisfactory. He came over to the wall's edge and leaned on it. "I'm George Flint. I farm the land to the east. Have done for 20 years, which means I've known this place for 20 years, and your man for about 4 of them. Mara Voss," she said. "Vane now, I suppose." George Flint nodded. He looked at the garden with the appraising eye of someone who tends his own and notices the state of others. "He planted those beans late," he observed. "3rd week of April. Should have been 2nd. I will mention it," she said. "He knows. He just always does things in his own time. A pause. Then, with the casual directness of a man who has never felt the need to work up to things. He's a good sort, your husband. Takes some time to know it, but he's a good sort. She sat back on her heels and looked at George Flint. He was looking at the beans. What sort of time? She asked. George Flint considered. He came here 4 years ago. Didn't speak much. Which in a man in the country can mean several things, and you don't know which, until time tells you. With him it meant he was listening. He listened for about a year. Then he started talking, and when he talked plain. No side to it. He shrugged. That's all I know about him, really. But that's not nothing, is it? No, she said. That is not nothing. George Flint nodded once more, with the air of a man who has said what he came to say, and considers the transaction complete. He climbed back over the wall, and went on across his own fields, and she watched him go for a moment, and then went back to the weeding. Aldrich found her still there an hour later. She heard him come around the corner of the house before she saw him, the particular sound of his boots on the stone path that she had already, without intending to, begun to distinguish from other sounds. He stopped at the edge of the garden and looked at what she had done, which was a good deal, and then he looked at her. You did not have to start there, he said. I know, she said. The beans were planted a week late. A pause. George Flint, he said. He came over the wall, she said. Something moved in Aldrich's face. The corner of the mouth thing. The approach to something. He always comes over the wall. He has been coming over that wall since before I arrived. I think he considers the low section a door he installed himself. She pulled the last weed in the section she was working, tossed it into the pile she had made at the side, and sat back on her heels and looked at the garden. There was still a great deal of it to do, but the section she had finished looked like itself again. The rows visible, the soil around the plants clear and dark. I found your ledger books, she said, the farm accounts. Silence, not a hostile silence, a waiting one. They are very well kept, she said. I have had practice, he said. She stood. Her knees informed her that she had been kneeling on stone-embedded ground for 2 hours. She ignored them. My father's accounts are not well kept. I have been keeping them for 4 years in an attempt to know the actual numbers before the situation became unmendable. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. And did you? I knew the numbers. I had less ability to do anything about them than I would have liked. She looked at him. The arrangement helped the numbers. She had not said this before. Not to him, not to herself out loud. It was a fact she had been carrying privately, the way you carry facts that feel like they should matter to a feeling you have not decided to have yet. He met her gaze directly. Yes, he said. It did. I was aware of that when I approached your father. So there was also a practical dimension to your honesty, she said. There always is, he said. I did not think it honest to pretend otherwise. She looked at him for a moment, at his steady, ordinary face with its unhurried quality. You are very consistent, she said. In what way? In that way. In keeping the thing it is easiest to let slip when it becomes inconvenient. He did not respond immediately. She picked up her gloves from the ground where she had left them and slapped the dirt off them against her hand. The garden smelled of turned earth and something green and forward-moving, the smell of things beginning. I did not expect you to start on the garden, he said after a moment, on the 4th day. What did you expect? I am not certain. Something requiring more adjustment first. She considered this. I am good at adjusting, she said. I find adjustment less difficult than waiting. Yes, he said. I can see that. She walked back toward the house, pulling her gloves back on. At the door, she paused. Inside, the kitchen was warm from the range, and the jar that had held the flowers was empty on the table and needed something in it, and there were several things in the garden that could go in it, though she had not decided what yet. What is behind the door? She asked, not looking at him, looking at the empty jar. Behind her, a pause. She counted it in breaths, not seconds. Materials, he said finally. Papers, documents, things I brought with me from the north. She turned then. He was standing at the edge of the kitchen, leaning against the doorframe, his arms loose at his sides, not guarded, not closed, looking at her, with the same direct, unperformative steadiness with which he had been looking at her since the church. "You did not lock it when you arrived," she said. "You brought the lock with you." His eyes moved, a slight shift of attention, like something registering. "Yes," he said, "I brought it. It is a finer lock than anything else in this house," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. The kitchen was warm, and the range ticked, and the empty jar sat on the table between them like a small, specific question mark. "Will you tell me what those papers are?" she asked. Another pause, longer this time. She could see him thinking, not evasively but genuinely, the way a person thinks when they are trying to find the honest answer to something that has more than one honest answer available, and needs to choose the right one. "Not yet," he said. "I will. But not yet." She considered that answer. She turned it over. She tested its edges for deception, and found none. There was a difference between a man who was hiding something because he intended to keep it hidden, and a man who was keeping something because the timing of its telling mattered to him, and she was not yet sure which category this was, but the "not yet" had the quality of an intention, rather than an evasion. It had a timeline in it, even if the timeline was unstated. "All right," she said. She went back inside and put the kettle on. He came in a few minutes later and sat at the table, and they had tea, as they had had it before, in the working quiet of two people who are still learning the grammar of each other's company. And outside the garden settled in the late afternoon, and the lane was quiet, and somewhere over the east wall, George Flint was probably doing his own evening rounds, and finding nothing particularly surprising in any of it, which struck her as the most sensible response available to anyone at the moment. She found the empty jar on the table the next morning, with a few stems of early wild flowers in it, the small blue ones that came up in the lane verges in spring. She did not know if he had put them there, or if they had simply blown in through the open window, which was not possible, but which was how it felt. She left them on the table. She went back to the garden. The beans needed tying up, and the soil on the east side had crusted over, and there was a row of something she could not identify, that might have been carrots, or might have been something entirely different, and she needed the farm's books from the cabinet to check what had been planted where, which gave her a reason to open the cabinet again. And she did not take out the books, but she looked at them in there, orderly and complete, and she thought about numbers, and what they said when they were kept honestly, and about the door at the end of the hallway, and about a man who had said "not yet," with the particular quality of a man who means a different time, rather than never. She thought she could wait for a different time. She was, after all, quite good at waiting when the thing she was waiting for was real. In the evening, she looked at the blue flowers in the jar and decided that whatever had put them there, the fact of their being there, was sufficient for now. The day after that, she wrote a letter to her mother, telling her that the farmhouse was solid and the garden was productive, and the accounts, as far as she had seen them, were in good order. She did not say more than that. She sent it with the morning's post. Then she went to look at the east fence, which she had noted from the lane the previous day was missing 2 posts, and she added it to the mental list she was keeping, which was not yet a written list because she had not yet decided whether to make a written list, but the mental one was accurate and growing. She was paying attention, she was always paying attention, and the farm, for its part, was beginning to feel, in the small, specific way that places feel when you have been in them long enough to learn their patterns, like a place that was willing to be known. The letter came on a Wednesday, which meant nothing to Mara until it meant everything. She had gone into the village for flour and a length of cotton she needed to repair the curtain in the upstairs room, because the curtain had a tear in it that let the early morning light in at an angle that woke her an hour before she wanted to be woken, which she had tolerated for 3 weeks before deciding that the fabric and thread it would take to fix it were cheaper than the hour of sleep she was losing. This was the kind of calculation she was good at. She was good at all the small calculations of a life run sensibly. Aldrich had gone out to the north pasture before dawn about a problem with the fence line. A real problem this time. Not the east fence she had noted in the first week, which had been repaired quickly and without drama, but a longer section where something had gotten into it during the night, and there was livestock to account for. She had heard him go. She had learned to hear him go in the mornings, learned the sound of him getting up in the dark and the quiet sounds of his boots on the stairs and the kitchen door. She had her own rhythm now, 3 weeks in, her own sound of it. She went to the village with her market basket and the list she kept in her head, and the easy competence of someone who has understood a household's needs and can supply them without excess or shortage. The village near the farm was not Hartwell. It was called Dunn's Cross, and it was smaller and quieter, and had not, as far as she could tell, received the news of who she was, or what her husband was, or wasn't, which she found deeply restful. At the post office, she collected what was there: 2 letters for Aldrich, 1 for her. She put his in the basket with the flour and the cotton. She turned hers over in her hands without opening it. It was from Lotta. She opened it on the bench outside the post office, because Lotta's letters were always cheerful and readable, and she enjoyed them, and she sat in the mild morning and read. Lotta's letter was 4 pages, which was Lotta's usual length, and it moved through subjects with the fluid confidence of someone who finds everything equally interesting and does not believe in transitions. It covered the state of the garden at Hartwell, which Lotta had apparently taken personal responsibility for in Mara's absence, a dinner at the Greens' house where someone had said something tactless about northern farming families, and Lotta had responded with information she was not entirely certain of, but that had won the argument regardless. A book she had read, a walk she had taken, and then, on the 3rd page, the sentence that Mara read twice. Your name came up at the county assembly, apparently in connection with something that was in the northern correspondence, and Mrs. George said she had heard that Lord Vane of Crestmore was involved in something to do with a boundary dispute and the Whitmore family, which is the family that has the large estate north of the ridge, and that there was a considerable legal matter attached to it, and that Lord Vane was expected to return to the north proper to deal with it. And I thought you should know, because I am not certain anyone has told you. Mara read that paragraph again. Then she folded the letter, put it in her basket, and sat for a moment, looking at Dunn's Cross's quiet high street, with the particular quality of attention of a person who has just received information that changes the shape of something they were already looking at. Boundary dispute. Whitmore family. Expected to return. Legal matter. She thought about the door. She thought about the lock that was finer than anything else in the house. She thought about not yet, said with the quality of a different time rather than never. She walked back to the farmhouse with her basket and put everything away and put the kettle on and put Aldrich's 2 letters on the table where he would see them when he came in. Then she took the letter from Lotta and put it in her pocket and went to the sitting room and sat in the chair by the window and read it again more carefully this time. There was nothing more than what she had already extracted. Lotta's letters were informative, but not precise, and what she had was the outline of something and not its substance. She was still in the chair when the kitchen door opened an hour later, and Aldrich came in, which she heard and noted, and then went back to what she was doing, which was thinking. He came to the door of the sitting room. He had the look of a man who had been outdoors since before dawn and had done a considerable amount of physical work since then, which was to say he looked like himself, because this was what he looked like on most days. His boots were muddy, and he had taken them off at the door as he always did, and he was in his wool socks on the stone floor of the sitting room doorway. The fence is dealt with, he said. No livestock lost. A hare got into the fence from the inside, apparently, which I had not thought possible. Hares are determined, she said. Yes. He looked at her, with the attention that was one of the things she had learned about him in 3 weeks, the specific quality of his attention, when he was reading something from her that she had not said yet. Are you well? I am well, she said. Your letters are on the kitchen table. He went to get them. She stayed in the chair. She heard him in the kitchen, the kettle, the cup, the specific quiet that fell over a room when someone was reading. Then silence. Then more silence. Then his boots on the kitchen floor, which meant he had sat down. She gave him time. She was good at giving time. She had given time to many things in her life, to her father's decisions and her mother's silences, and the accounts that never quite balanced, and the fence that needed repairing, and the beans planted a week late. She gave time the way she gave attention, consistently and without drama. When she heard the chair push back, she went to the kitchen. He was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the yard. His 2 letters were on the table. She could not see their contents from where she stood, but she could see the way he was standing, which was slightly different from his usual way of standing. Something in the shoulders. Not defeat. Nothing as simple as that. Something more like the posture of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just had occasion to feel the weight of it more acutely than usual. She sat down at the table. He turned around. He looked at her, then at the table, then at her again. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat in it and put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "There is a letter from my solicitor," he said, "and one from my steward at Crestmore." She waited. "There is a legal matter," he said, "with the Whitmore family, a boundary dispute that has been running for 3 years. It has reached a point where it requires my presence in the north to resolve it. Specifically, my presence in person, and my presence as myself." A pause. "As the Duke of Crestmore." Silence. The kitchen ticked. A bird outside. She looked at the letters on the table, then at his hands on the table, flat and still, the hands she had been watching for 3 weeks, the hands that held things with certainty. "I know," she said. He looked up. "I received a letter from my cousin this morning," she said. She mentioned a boundary dispute and the Whitmore family, and a legal matter. I did not know the details, but the shape of it was there. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you known about Crestmore?" She thought about the answer, because there were several honest versions of it. "Since the envelope," she said. There was an envelope addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Crestmore. "It arrived at the kitchen table about 6 weeks ago. I put it back where I found it and put the kettle on." His expression moved through something that was not quite surprise, because it was more considered than surprise, and not quite respect, because it was more personal than that. "You did not say anything. You had not told me," she said. "I was waiting for you to tell me. I was going to." "I know," she said. "You said not yet, with the quality of a not yet that had a when in it, rather than a never." She looked at his hands. "I believe that. It is one of the things I have found, in 3 weeks, that I believe about you, which is that when you say a thing, you mean the specific thing, rather than the approximate one." He was very still. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the yard was doing its ordinary afternoon business. The chickens they kept for eggs moving along the wall. The apple tree dropping its spent blossoms in the light wind. "The Duke title," she said. "What does it mean in practice?" "The estate at Crestmore. The size of it." "Large," he said. "Considerably larger than this. There are 3 villages under the estate's stewardship, and a house that requires a staff of some significant number to maintain, which I have been maintaining in my absence at some expense, and considerably less effectively than if I were there." "Because you chose to be here instead." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "And this legal matter requires you to return." "Requires me to return as myself," he said. "Yes. The Whitmore family are challenging a boundary that has been the Crestmore boundary for 140 years. My solicitor has managed the documentation, but they are refusing to accept the arbitration without the Duke of Crestmore present in person." She looked at him. He looked at her. The distance between them across the kitchen table was not large, but it felt significant, the way the space between 2 things feels significant when something is passing across it. "You will have to go back," she said. "Yes. And I will need to go with you," she said. "As your wife. As the Duchess of Crestmore." He held her gaze. "Yes, if you are willing." She thought about the farmhouse, and the vegetable garden, and the ledger books in the cabinet, and the low wall, where George Flint came over from the east, and the jar of small blue flowers, and the sound of Aldrich's boots, on the stairs, in the morning dark. She thought about 3 weeks, and what 3 weeks was, which was very little in one sense, and in another sense, was the beginning of something she had not had a name for, and was only beginning to develop the vocabulary for. She thought about a woman who spent 4 years doing accounts for a household that could not afford to look at its own numbers honestly. "I am willing," she said. The word willing hung in the kitchen air between them, and she heard it as she said it, and knew it was the precise word, and not the approximate one, which was something she was learning from him, the habit of saying the specific thing, rather than the comfortable one. She was willing. She was not excited, not afraid, not resigned. She was willing, which was a different thing from all of them. He looked at her for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," he said. "When I made the arrangement, I had a picture of how the first months would go. I was wrong about almost all of it. What were you wrong about? He thought for a moment. I thought it would take longer, he said, to be in the same room properly. I thought there would be more careful distance first. She looked at the kitchen table between them. There is still quite a lot of careful distance, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. The approach. Less than I planned for, he said. She stood. She picked up his letters, aligned them together neatly, and placed them on top of the pile on the sideboard where the farm correspondents lived. She put the kettle on. We should write to the solicitor today, she said, and your steward. If the matter is pressing, we should not delay more than necessary. No, he said, we should not. She waited for the kettle, and when it had boiled, she made the tea and brought his cup to the table and sat back down, and he sat across from her, and between them on the table was the ordinary space of a kitchen afternoon, and above it was everything that was about to change. She poured her own tea, wrapped her hands around the cup. Tell me about Crestmore, she said, the actual place. Not the title, not the legal matter. Tell me what it looks like. And he did. She had imagined something cold. Not consciously, not as a formed expectation she had put into words, but somewhere in the back part of her mind, where images form without being invited, she had imagined the north as gray and hard, stone walls meeting stone sky, everything scraped clean by altitude and weather, into a kind of magnificent severity. She had imagined Crestmore as a house in keeping with that severity, tall and dark and complicated with the accumulated weight of 140 years of the same family managing the same land. She had been right about the stone. She had been wrong about everything else. They made the journey over 3 days, which was 2 days longer than the most direct route, but 2 days shorter than the scenic one Aldrich had mentioned in the early planning, because the legal matter had a date attached to it, and dates had the inescapable quality of caring nothing about scenic routes. They traveled by the hired coach that Aldrich had arranged for the purpose, which was better than the cart, and less formal than anything a duke might be expected to travel in, which struck Mara as deliberately calibrated, and which she chose not to comment on. On the second day the hills began. Not the gentle folded hills of the valley country around Hartwell, not the agricultural roll of the land near the farm. These were real hills, hills with intention, hills that went up steeply and stayed up, their flanks covered in the particular shade of green that comes from altitude and high rain, and between the hills the valleys were deeper and narrower and darker, and the light on them was different from the light on flat country, more directional, more dramatic, arriving at angles that made everything it touched slightly more emphatic than usual. She looked out the window for most of the second day. Aldrich sat across from her and did the reading he had brought, a collection of the legal documents he needed to know before the arbitration, which he read with the steady, absorbing focus of a man who has learned to work inside the movement of a vehicle. He had said very little that day. Not from distance, she had learned to read the different qualities of his silence by now, but from concentration. He was preparing. She let him prepare. On the evening of the second day, they stopped at an inn in a town called Birchgate, which was large enough to have 2 inns, and small enough that both of them were half full on a weekday evening. The one they stopped at had a good fire and a table by the window, and a kitchen that produced a meat pie that was excellent in the uncelebrated, fundamental way of food, made by people who consider excellence a standard rather than an achievement. Over the pie Aldrich had spoken, but not about Crestmore, not about the legal matter, not about any of the things that were coming. He had talked about the second hill they had passed, which had a particular history, a fortification from an earlier century. Nothing visible from the road but the earthwork outline, still readable from a certain angle. He knew the history precisely, not the academic knowledge of someone who had researched a thing, but the resident knowledge of someone who had walked the ground and talked to the people whose families had been there when the fortification was built. She had listened to him talk and noticed, not for the first time, that the things he knew well were the things he had learned by being present for them, not by reading about them, though he read considerably, by being in the place, by talking to the people, by arriving with sufficient quietness that things told themselves to him. It was, she thought, probably the same instinct that had brought him to the farm, to be present for something, rather than to possess it. She had not said this to him. She was not sure he needed it said to him by her. He probably already knew it about himself, the way people who understand themselves well know their own instincts without needing to name them out loud. On the third morning, she woke at dawn and looked out the inn window at the hills in the early light, and felt something she had not felt before, a feeling that had no obvious cause and no obvious name, which was a sharp, clear sense of being in motion, towards something rather than away from it. She had spent a long time, she realized, being in motion, away from things. Away from the accounts that didn't balance. Away from the letter beside the butter dish. Away from the laughter in the church. And now she was moving towards something, and the something was entirely unknown, which should have been frightening, and was instead something else, something that felt more like the quality of the air before rain, electric and expectant. Crestmore announced itself before it came into view. First there was the gatehouse, a low stone building, with 2 arched openings for the road to pass through, and a man at it who saw the coach coming from a distance, and had the gate open by the time they reached it. He nodded at Aldrich through the window with the recognition of a long-established familiarity. No ceremony, no announcement, just the gate opening, and the man nodding, and the coach continuing through. Then the drive, long, lined on both sides by trees that had been there long enough to form a continuous ceiling of branches above the road, filtering the morning light into a moving pattern of sun and shadow. The trees were oak, and they were old, very old, the kind of old that had outrun counting. Then the house. It was not dark. That was the first thing she registered. It was built from the local stone, which was not gray but a warm, pale amber, and in the morning light, it reflected that light rather than absorbing it, so that the whole long face of the house was softly illuminated, the windows catching and returning the sun like a collection of clear answers. It was large, much larger than she had assembled from his description, and it rose to 4 stories and spread itself along a plateau above the valley, with the comfortable authority of something that has belonged in a place for long enough that the landscape has stopped noticing the distinction between where the land ends and the building begins. She did not say anything when she saw it. She looked at it for a long moment through the window, and then she looked at Aldrich. He was watching her look at the house. His expression was careful in a way she had not seen it be careful before, a carefulness that was not guardedness but something more like uncertainty. The expression of someone who has set something down in front of another person, and is waiting to learn what that person will do with it. "You have been here the whole time," she said, "in the background of everything." "In one sense," he said. "Yes. It is considerably more than 3 villages and forest land," she said. Something moved in his face. The solicitor's letter may have underrepresented the scale slightly. She looked back at the house, at the drive still carrying them toward it, at the gatehouse now behind them, at the old oaks with their continuous ceiling. "Why did you leave?" she asked. "Really, not the version about knowing yourself without your title. The actual answer." The coach slowed as they came to the main entrance. A man was already coming down the front steps with the composure of a steward who has been managing an estate for many years and has seen arrivals of all kinds and has decided to let none of them particularly surprise him. Aldrich did not answer her question before the door opened. She stepped out into the morning air of Crestmore and looked up at the house from the ground, and it was even larger from the ground than from the coach. The man on the steps, who introduced himself as Henry Marsh, the estate steward, welcomed her with the formal warmth of someone doing both his job and something beyond his job, because there was a quality to his welcome that was not entirely professional. Something relieved under the professionalism. She filed it. Inside the house was warm and smelled of wood fires, and the specific old stone smell that she recognized from the farm, but deeper, more settled. The smell of stone that has held warmth for a very long time and has stopped having to work at it. She was shown to her rooms by a housekeeper named Mrs. Clay, who was small and efficient, and who walked with the authority of a woman who has run a large house for a long time and has no interest in any alternative. The rooms were 2. A bedroom and a small sitting room adjacent to it, and they looked east over a walled garden that was ordered and full of early green, and beyond it, the valley and the hills that came down to it from both sides. She looked at the view for a long time. Then she unpacked her own things, because the maid who had been sent to help her had been sent away politely, and she did it in the systematic way she did everything, which meant everything had a place before she stopped. And then she sat in the chair by the east window and looked at the valley and thought. The legal matter was tomorrow morning, in the estate's own receiving room, where Aldrich's solicitor and the Whitmore family's solicitor and a neutral arbitrator from the county were all convening. She would not attend that. It was not her matter. She would be in the house, learning its architecture, which was what she intended to do today. She spent the afternoon with Mrs. Clay, who was pleased to be asked, and who walked her through the house with the thoroughness of a woman who takes pride in knowing what she manages. They went through the main rooms, the kitchen and its annexes, the linen rooms, the library, the receiving rooms, the study. They did not go upstairs to the family rooms, except those allotted to Mara. Mrs. Clay had a sense of protocol. In the library she stopped. The books were substantial and numerous, and well organized, but that was not what stopped her. It was the desk in the center of the library, a wide working desk with drawers on both sides, and on it, in orderly arrangement, were documents and correspondence that she recognized from their general character as estate documents, the kind she had seen in miniature form in the farm's ledger books. But these were different in scale. These were the documents of something very large, managed from a distance for 4 years, managed at a cost she could see in the sheer volume of work that management had required. She stood at the desk and did not touch anything, but she looked, and she understood, in the particular clear way she understood numbers, how much work it was to run something this size badly, compared with how much work it would be to run it well, with the right attention applied. A great deal of work, she thought, had been done here by people who were doing their best without the person whose knowledge of the place should have been guiding them. She thought about the farm's ledger books, their precision, the quality of his attention to 100 acres, and a vegetable garden, and a fence line, and a hare that had gotten into things from the inside. If he brought that quality of attention here, she thought, these documents would look very different in a year. If she brought her own quality of attention here. She stood at the desk for a long time. That evening Aldrich found her still in the library. Not at the desk, but in the chair by the window with a book she had taken from the shelf, though she was not reading it. She was looking at the valley in the last light, which was doing something extraordinary with color, the hills going a deep purple, and the sky above them a pale gold, and the valley floor still green in the last of the day. He came in and sat in the other chair without turning on the lamp, so that they were in the failing light of the window, and he did not speak immediately, and she did not speak, and the library settled around them. "You asked me why I left," he said after a while. "The real answer." She waited. "It was after my father died," he said. "He managed this place the way he managed everything, by force of will, which was considerable. He was not an unkind man, but he was a very present man, and when he was gone, the absence of him was enormous. Not grief exactly, though that was part of it, more that I did not know how to be in this house without him in it, telling me what it was and what I was in relation to it." He paused. "I thought if I went somewhere else and learned what I was without any of this around me, I would come back knowing how to be here." "And did you?" she asked. "Learn what you were?" "I learned what I was comfortable with," he said, "which is perhaps not the same thing." "What are you comfortable with?" "Work that I can hold in my hands," he said. "People who speak directly. A view that does not ask anything of me. A pause. Honesty, which I find more comfortable than its absence, even when its absence would be easier." She looked at the valley going dark. "And now you have come back." "Because it was time," he said. "And because the legal matter required it. And because—" He stopped. "I am not sure I was going to be able to stay away indefinitely. I think I knew that." She turned from the window and looked at him in the nearly dark of the library. "Henry Marsh is glad you are back," she said. "I could see it, Mrs. Clay as well." "I know," he said. "They have been managing something I should have been here to manage." She thought about the documents on the desk, about the farm's ledger books. "You will need help," she said, "with the correspondence and the estate accounts. Not because you cannot do it alone, but because the volume of it is more than one person can hold." He looked at her. In the half-dark, his face was very still and very present. "You are offering," he said. "I kept the Hartwell accounts for 4 years," she said. "The Hartwell accounts were a disaster that I was trying to prevent from becoming a catastrophe. These accounts are not a disaster. If I am given access to them, I think I can help make them considerably better." Silence for a moment. "You looked at the desk," he said. "Yes," she said. "I looked. I did not touch anything." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, You can have access to whatever you need." She nodded. They sat in the library in the last of the light, and the valley outside went fully dark, and the house around them settled into the sounds it made when it was done with the day. The old wood speaking to itself, the fire in the grate ticking down. And Mara sat in the library chair of Crestmore, and felt, quite clearly and without particular drama, that the shape of her life had just changed its outline again, and that the new outline was larger than the previous one. She was not afraid of larger. She had always been more capable than her circumstances had required. Now, it seemed, the circumstances were beginning to catch up. The arbitration took 4 hours. Mara was in the library for all of them. She had not intended to spend the morning in the library. She had intended to walk the walled garden, and then the grounds beyond it, to begin building the physical knowledge of the estate, the way she built the knowledge of everything, by being in it, by walking it, and measuring it with her steps and her eyes, until its shape was clear to her. But the morning was wet, the kind of heavy North Country rain that arrives without warning, and settles in for the day with the confidence of a thing that intends to be taken seriously. And the library had the desk with the documents on it, and she was in the library. She did not go through the documents in any organized way. She was not authorized to do that yet, and she understood the difference between having been offered access to what she needed and having access already. The difference was timing, and timing was one of the things she was careful about. But she read what was visible, what was sitting on the surface of the desk without needing to be opened or unfolded. And from the surfaces of things you can learn a great deal if you know how to look. What she learned was this: the Whitmore dispute was not about the boundary in the simple sense of a line on a map. It was about a piece of land at the boundary's edge that had agricultural value and water access, and the Whitmore family had been building a legal argument around a contested survey from 60 years ago that had placed the line in their favor, and the counter-argument was Crestmore's original documents, which predated the survey by 80 years, and which showed the boundary in its current position with considerable legal clarity. The argument was not actually difficult. It was protracted because the Whitmore family had a solicitor who was earning a fee by keeping it protracted. She came to this conclusion from the surface documents and the general shape of the correspondence, and she thought she was probably right, but that she might be missing something in the specifics, and she set the question aside and went to the bookshelves and found something to read that had nothing to do with boundary disputes, and read it in the chair by the window with the rain on the glass. At noon, Henry Marsh knocked on the library door and told her luncheon was ready in the small dining room, and she thanked him and asked whether His Grace was still in the receiving room, and Henry said he was, and she said she would wait. And Henry looked at her with the particular expression of a steward who has managed a large estate through a long absence and has just received the first piece of evidence that the new wife is capable of judgment. Waldrick came out at 1:30. She heard him in the hall before she saw him. His voice, and another voice she did not recognize, and then his steps, and then he was in the library doorway, with his coat slightly damp at the shoulders, from some transit through the rain, and his expression doing the thing it did, when he had been thinking hard for a long time, and had arrived at the end of the thinking. "Done," he said. "The boundary holds?" she asked. "The boundary holds." It was not particularly difficult once the arbitrator had seen the original documents, which I had brought in their entirety, and which the Whitmore solicitor had apparently hoped would be less complete than they were. "I thought it might be something like that," she said, "from what was visible on the desk." He came fully into the library, and sat in the other chair, and stretched his legs, and looked at the ceiling briefly. The look of a man releasing 4 hours of legal attention back into the general air. "You looked at the desk," he said. "Only what was visible," she said. "I did not go through anything." "I know," he said. "I would have told you, if anything required more privacy than that." He looked at her. "Was I right about the survey?" "You were right that the original documents predated it by enough to make it inadmissible," she said. "I could not tell from the surface whether the survey itself was fabricated, or simply contested." "Contested," he said, "not fabricated. The surveyor made genuine errors, I think, and the Whitmore family have been exploiting those errors in good faith rather than in bad. It does not change the outcome, but it changes how I feel about their solicitor." She thought about that, about the distinction between exploiting honestly and exploiting dishonestly, and about his consistent interest in that distinction. "How do you feel about their solicitor?" "Less adversarially than before," he said. "He is a man doing his job with the tools available to him. The tools turned out to be insufficient." She nodded. Henry knocked again, and Aldrich called him in, and they were directed to the small dining room, where luncheon was waiting, and they ate in the comfortable, companionable way that she had begun to expect from meals with him, conversation moving without strain, between the practical and the considered, and occasionally something that was neither, but was simply interesting. He told her about the arbitrator, a man named Cole who was apparently very good at his work, and who had a method of reading competing documents that Aldrich admired. She told him what she had concluded from the desk. He confirmed the parts she had gotten right, and corrected one detail she had extrapolated incorrectly, which she noted without defensiveness, because incorrect information was simply incorrect information, and there was no value in defending it. After lunch, he took her through the grounds. The rain had stopped while they ate, which in the north meant it would return, but the interim was usable, and they walked together through the walled garden, and then out through the gate in the garden wall to the broader grounds beyond it. The estate extended to the valley below, and up the hill behind the house, and along the ridge to both sides, and there was a great deal of it, and she could not see all of it in one afternoon. But she could see the shape of it, the way the land organized itself, the way the wall of the kitchen garden connected to the orchard, and how the orchard connected to the meadow, and how the meadow ran to the tree line at the bottom, where the stream was. He knew the land the way he had known the farm, by being in it. He knew where the drainage was poor, and where the soil changed, and where the old sheep tracks still showed in the turf even though the sheep that had made them were long gone. He had learned all of this before he left, she realized, and the 4 years away had not taken it from him. The way that real knowledge of a place does not go when you leave. It is simply suspended, waiting. "There is a great deal of work here," she said. They were standing at the tree line, looking back up at the house on its plateau, which from here was a different house than from the drive, all its north face visible, the valley behind them making it seem larger and more deliberate, a thing that had been placed exactly where it was. "Yes," he said, "there is. But it is work that has structure," she said. The farm had structure too. The accounts were kept well. The decisions had been made sensibly. This is the same instinct, larger. He looked at her. "You are not daunted," he said. "I did not say that," she said. "I said, it has structure. Daunted and capable are not mutually exclusive." He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she had not quite seen on him before. She thought about it while he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the valley spread itself behind both of them in the patchy light of a north country afternoon. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Do you want to be here?" he said. "Not are you willing. Not can you manage it. Do you want it?" She felt the difference between those questions immediately, the precise, serious difference between willingness and want, between capability and desire. It was a question that expected an honest answer, and not a polite one, and not a sensible one, and not the answer that was easiest to give. She looked at the house, at the stone the color of pale amber in the afternoon light, at the library window where she had spent the morning, at the walled garden they had just walked through, which was organized and full of early growth, and which would be extraordinary in summer if the attention it clearly received continued. "I think I might," she said. "I did not expect to. I thought I would manage it, which is different. But standing here, I think there might be something more than managing." He was quiet. "That surprises me," she said. "I am telling you that honestly because you asked, and you asked directly, and the specific quality of your question requires the specific quality of answer, and the specific answer is that I came here expecting to be capable, and I am finding something I did not plan for." "What are you finding?" he said. She looked at the house. "I do not have a word for it yet," she said. "I have been looking for one for some time, since the cart, actually." Something happened in his face that was not the corner of the mouth approach. It was larger than that, quieter than that, the kind of movement that faces make when something reaches them before they have prepared a response to it. They walked back up to the house in the failing afternoon light, and the north country clouds moved over the valley with their confident weight, and the stone of the house went from amber to gray as the light went, and she walked beside him on the path through the meadow and up through the orchard gate. That evening she sat at the library desk for the first time. He had said she could have access to what she needed, and she needed to understand the accounts before she could help with them, and so she sat at the desk in the lamplight and opened the first of the estate ledgers and began. She worked until 10. Aldrich sat in the other chair for the first part of the evening reading, and then he went to arrange the correspondence from the arbitration, and then he came back. And by then, she was deep in the second year's accounts and had made her first set of notes in the small notebook she had taken from the desk drawer. When he came in, he did not interrupt. He sat in the chair and read. She worked. The fire went down, and he put more wood on it, without being asked. The house settled around them in its evening sounds, the old wood and the stone and the particular voice of a large house at night. Its different quality, from a farmhouse's nighttime voice, deeper, more layered, carrying more history. At 10, she closed the ledger and sat back in the chair and looked at her notes. 3 things, she said. He looked up from his book. 3 things that need immediate attention. 1 is the timber management on the north slope, which has not been properly surveyed in at least 3 years and which I suspect is under-yielding. 2 is the tenancy agreements in the western holdings, 2 of which have irregularities that could cause problems if not addressed. 3 is the household accounts, which are overstaffed in 2 areas and understaffed in 1, and the imbalance is costing more than it should. He looked at her for a long moment. You found all of that in 1 evening, he said. I found the beginnings of it, she said. I would need more time to be certain, but the shape of it is there. The shape of it, he said. Then, quietly, Henry Marsh has been saying some version of the timber concern for 2 years. I told him to address it, and I think he did not know how. I can work with Henry Marsh, she said. He is a good steward. He needs someone to do the analysis and give him the conclusions. He is a man who excels at execution. Aldrich stood. He came to the desk and looked at her notes, which she had written in the compressed, organized shorthand of someone who has kept accounts for years and knows how to make a lot of information take up a small amount of space. He read them in silence, all of them, turning the page when he reached the end of the front. Then he put the notebook down. You are good at this, he said. Yes, she said. I have been good at it for a long time. I simply have not had the appropriate scale before. He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face had the quality it had in the farmhouse kitchen, the ordinary, steady quality of a man who is exactly where he is and does not need anywhere else. She looked back at him and felt, quite clearly, the word she had been looking for. Not the word for what she felt, a different word, the word for what this was, what she had been finding in the cart, and the farmhouse, and the library, and the valley, and the walk back up through the orchard. The word was beginning. Not an ending of something, not a replacement of something, a beginning, with all the unknown territory that a beginning implies, and all the work, and all the possibility. She was not afraid of beginnings either. She put the notebook back in the drawer, and put out the lamp on the desk, and stood in the remaining light of the fire. We should discuss the North Slope timber in the morning, she said, when we are not tired. Yes, he said, we should. She said good night. He said good night. She went upstairs to the room with the east window, and the view of the walled garden and the valley, and she looked at the valley in the dark, which was very dark in the way that valleys between hills are dark, and she thought about words, and about beginnings, and about a woman who had spent 4 years keeping someone else's accounts in order to prevent a disaster, and who was now sitting at a desk with 100 acres in one hand, and the beginnings of something she had not planned for in the other, and who was, on balance, more capable of both than she had been given credit for, and who intended to demonstrate that thoroughly. She went to sleep with the rain coming back on the window and the hills dark around her, and it was the most complete sleep she had had in months. The first letter of correction arrived from Hartwell on a Thursday, 6 weeks after Mara had left for the north, and it was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Aldrich, His Grace, the Duke of Crestmore, which was a title that Hartwell had apparently discovered with the enthusiasm of a village that has been given new information and has decided to make the most of it. The letter was from someone Mara did not recognize at first, and then she looked at the signature and saw it was from a cousin of Mrs. Pole, which explained everything, and she put it in the estate correspondence pile without reading the body of it, because some letters tell you what they are before you open them. Over the next 2 weeks, 7 more letters arrived, by various routes, with various pretexts, all of them, when reduced to their substance, communicating the same essential thing. Hartwell had learned who Aldrich was, and Hartwell was very sorry it had laughed, and Hartwell wished to be on record as having always thought very highly of the match. She knew about all of them. Henry Marsh handled the estate correspondence, and the system she had put in place meant she reviewed all of it and directed each piece to the appropriate action. The letters from Hartwell required no action. She filed them in a folder she labeled Correspondence, Social, Unsolicited, which was a sufficiently honest description that she felt no particular need to elaborate. Aldrich saw the folder. He did not comment on its contents directly. He said, one evening in the library, "The post from the south has been active," and she said yes, and that was the end of it, which was how they handled things between them now. The acknowledgement without the excavation, the shared understanding that a thing had been noted and would be managed, and did not require a full review of its implications, unless one of them wanted a full review. She did not want one. What she wanted was for the letters to stop arriving, which they would, in time, when Hartwell found something else to organize its collective attention around. Villages always did. It was one of the things you could rely on. What she could also rely on, and had been relying on for 6 weeks, was the work. The work at Crestmore was substantial and real, and pulled her attention forward rather than backward, which she had discovered was the best kind of work, for a woman who was disposed to be in the present tense, rather than the past, or future one. The timber survey on the North Slope had taken 3 weeks to complete properly, which was 2 weeks longer than she had initially budgeted for, because the North Slope had not been surveyed in more than 3 years, and 3 years of unmanaged growth had produced a situation considerably more complicated than her initial assessment had suggested. She and Henry Marsh had walked it together on 4 separate occasions, and she had brought in a man from the next valley, who knew the timber trade, and together, they had produced a document that told Aldrich exactly what he had, what it was worth, what it would cost to bring it into proper management, and what it would yield over the next 5 years, if that management was applied. She had sat at the library desk and put the document together herself. The numbers were good. Not immediately. The first year would cost rather than yield, the cost of getting things into order never being avoidable. But by the 3rd year, the North Slope would be contributing to the estate, rather than sitting on the land doing nothing in particular with itself. Aldrich had read the document in one sitting. He had then set it down, looked at it for a moment, and said, "How confident are you in the 5-year projection?" "Moderately confident," she said. "The market figures are an estimate, and markets do not always cooperate with estimates. But the yield figures from the timberman are solid, and I have tested them against comparable properties in the county." "Which ones?" he said. She told him. He thought for a moment, then said, "The Kendrick properties' yield figures are inflated. They use a different counting method. If you adjust for that, the comparison holds, but you should note it in the document." She looked at him. "You know the Kendrick figures? I was at school with Edmund Kendrick. He tells people about his timber yields the way some men tell people about fish they have caught." She thought about this. "I will note the adjustment in the document," she said, "and I will recalculate the comparison accordingly." "It does not change the overall conclusion," he said, "only the precision." "Precision matters," she said. "In documents that go to solicitors and surveyors and men who will check the numbers, precision is what the work stands on." He looked at her over the library desk with the expression she had begun to recognize as his version of agreement that had something warm in it alongside the agreement. "Yes," he said, "it is." She revised the document. It was better for being revised. This was also something she had learned, that the willingness to revise was not weakness but intelligence, and that the people who could not revise what they had made were not protecting their work, but protecting their comfort, which were not the same thing. The tenancy agreements were a more delicate matter. There were 2 of them, with irregularities, as she had noted on the first evening, and when she had gone deeper into both, she had found that the irregularities were not errors or oversights, but were the product of arrangements made with the previous estate steward, the man who had preceded Henry Marsh, who had apparently made certain accommodations with certain tenants that benefited both parties in ways that the estate accounts did not reflect. She had brought this to Aldrich carefully, because tenancy matters were sensitive in ways that timber surveys were not, involving real people in real situations, and she was new to this estate and its people, and she understood the importance of not arriving somewhere and immediately disrupting the arrangements that had held the place together in your absence. He had listened to her careful presentation of the information without interrupting. Then he had said, "What do you recommend?" She had not expected the question in those exact terms. She had expected a discussion, a collaborative working through of options, the kind of conversation they had been having about most things. A direct request for her recommendation was something more than that. It was, she understood, a statement of something. "I recommend speaking with both tenants directly," she said. "Not through Henry, and not through legal correspondence. Directly. Finding out what they were getting from the arrangement, and why, and then deciding whether the arrangement was responding to a real need that the estate can address honestly, or whether it was simply a private agreement that happened to cost the estate money." "And if it is the former," he said, "then you address the need honestly," she said. "You change the tenancy terms to reflect reality, rather than concealing that reality behind an accommodation. The tenants are better protected by an honest document than by a private arrangement that could be challenged. And if it is the latter, then you end the arrangement, but carefully, and with sufficient time for the tenants to adjust. The estate has been absent for 4 years. You do not return from an absence and immediately enforce the letter of a situation that has moved in your absence, without acknowledging that the movement occurred." He had looked at her for a long time. Then he had said, "Would you come with me to speak to them?" She had said yes. They had gone together, to the first tenancy on a Friday morning, and the second the following Monday, and she had sat beside him in the kitchen of each tenant family's house and listened to the conversations he had with them, which were quiet and direct, and which produced, in both cases, the same outcome: a real need that the previous arrangement had been imperfectly addressing, and a real solution that the correct application of estate resources could provide instead. One of the tenants, a man named William Cross who had farmed his acreage for 30 years, had looked at Mara at the end of the first conversation and said, "You are the one who found it." "Yes," she had said. He had nodded. "Good to have an eye on things," he had said, not directed at Aldrich, at her, which was the most economical compliment she had ever received, and which she felt, quietly and without announcing it, was worth more than everything Hartwell had written in its 7 letters of belated approval. The third thing, the household accounts, she had addressed in the first 2 weeks with Mrs. Clay, who had turned out to be a woman who knew perfectly well that the staffing was unbalanced, and who had been waiting for someone to arrive who could make the adjustment without it becoming a crisis. The adjustment had been made. Nobody had lost a position. 3 people had had their responsibilities reallocated to where the work actually was, and 1 additional person had been brought in for the area that had been under-resourced. The accounts now reflected the actual cost of running the house and the actual distribution of that cost, which was lower overall than before, because waste in household accounts is most often the product of doing the wrong work in the right amount, rather than doing the right work in the wrong amount. She had explained this to Mrs. Clay using those exact words, and Mrs. Clay had looked at her with an expression that was the housekeeper's equivalent of George Flint's "good to have an eye on things," which Mara had received with the same quiet satisfaction. Lotta visited in the 7th week. She arrived on a Tuesday, which Mara noted, and she arrived with 2 trunks and the optimism she had always had, which the journey north had done nothing to reduce. She looked at Crestmore from the drive, with the expression of someone whose prediction has been substantially exceeded by its outcome. "It is not exactly a farmhouse," Lotta said. "No," Mara said, "it is not." "And he is," Lotte began, and then stopped, because Aldrich had come down the front steps to greet them, because that was something he did. He came to the door himself, and Lotte looked at him and recalibrated several of her remaining sentences very quickly. "He is," she said finally. "Yes, I see." "You are being cryptic," Mara said. "I am being tactful," Lotta said. "It is the same thing, and I am doing it for your benefit." Mara looked at her. "What benefit?" "The benefit," Lotta said, carefully, "of not having me say in full volume, in front of him, what I am currently thinking." "And what are you thinking?" Lotte looked at her. "That Hartwell made a very great deal of very unnecessary noise," she said, "for an outcome that looks considerably better than it did when the cart arrived." Mara was quiet for a moment. "The cart was a choice," she said. "I have understood that for some time." Lotta tilted her head. And what do you think of the choice now, after all of it? She thought about the farm, and the ledger books in the cabinet, and the jar of small blue flowers. She thought about the library desk, and the North Slope timber, and the tenancy conversations, and the morning walks through the walled garden. She thought about sitting across a kitchen table, with a man who said the specific thing, and not the approximate one, and who, in the 9 weeks since the church, had consistently been exactly what he appeared to be. I think, she said slowly, that a man who drives himself to his own wedding in a working cart, and does not apologize for it, is probably exactly the kind of man whose ledger books are kept in perfect order. That is the most you, she said. That is the most you I have ever heard you be about another person. Mara considered this. Thank you, she said. It was a compliment, Lotte said. I am glad you received it as one. She went to get Lotte settled, and to show her the east window room, and the walled garden, and the library, and the view of the valley that was different at every hour of the day, and that she had come to find she was not indifferent to, not indifferent at all. Behind her, as she walked up the front steps, she could hear Aldrich saying something to Lotte in the quiet, direct way he said things, and Lotte responding with the cheerful, comfortable ease she brought to all conversations, and the sound of it, the two of them talking in the drive in the morning, was a sound she added to the list of sounds she had been learning at Crestmore, the different voices of this place at different times of day, all of them beginning to be familiar. And Hartwell's 7 letters sat in the folder in the correspondence, social, unsolicited pile, and the village could think what it liked about the cart, and the laughter, and the outcome. And it could write as many letters of belated approval as it felt the need to write, and they would all sit in the folder and mean nothing whatsoever, because the things that were real had never needed Hartwell's approval to be real. They had only needed paying attention to, and she had been paying attention. Winter came to Crestmore differently than it came to Hartwell. In Hartwell, winter arrived like a gradual withdrawal, the light pulling back a little each day, the garden going quiet in increments, the house retreating into itself by degrees. It was a polite winter, southern and managed, the kind of winter that gave you time to prepare. In the north, winter arrived with intention. The hills that had been amber and green in October were suddenly, in the second week of November, something entirely different. Not gray, not simply leafless and dormant, white, and then brown underneath the white, and then white again, a shifting conversation between the weather and the land that did not require an audience and was happening regardless. The wind in the valley had a different quality than it had in summer, a quality that was not hostile, but was definitely purposeful, and it made itself known through the old stone of the house, in ways that the house was built to accommodate, but that Mara had not been built to expect. She liked it. That was the thing she had not predicted. She stood at the east window, on the first serious morning of it, and looked at the hills white in the early light, and felt something she recognized from the second day of the journey north. That sharp, clear sense of being in the right place, which was not a feeling she had substantial experience of, and which she intended to examine carefully when she had time. She did not have time immediately. The winter brought its own work at Crestmore, different from the autumn work but equally real. The timber management on the North Slope, now properly documented and planned, moved into its first phase of action before the ground froze, which meant a crew of men working under the direction of the timber surveyor for 3 weeks in November. And Mara had been out to the North Slope 4 times during those 3 weeks, to check that the work was matching the plan. It was, mostly. There was one section where the surveyor had made a different call than the plan indicated, and she had looked at the site and at the trees and at his reasoning, and concluded that his call was better than the plans, and she had made a note to revise the document, and had told him his call was sound, which he had received with the economy of a man who is glad to be confirmed in a good decision, and does not need more from the confirmation than that. The tenancy documents had been completed and signed in October. Both tenants had come to the house to do it, which was not the usual way these things were done, but Aldrich had suggested it, and she had agreed, because bringing people to the estate was different from going to them, and there were situations where the difference mattered, where what you were really doing was saying that this is a real place, and you are part of it, and the relationship between us is being formalized, rather than merely managed. William Cross had signed his new document with the gravity of a man who takes documents seriously, and then he had shaken Aldrich's hand, and then he had looked at Mara and said, "You'll do." which she had understood to be both the shortest and the most complete endorsement available to him, and had accepted accordingly. The household accounts had been stable for 2 months, which was a short time, but in her experience 2 months of stability, in a household that had previously been unstable, was meaningful data. Mrs. Clay had taken to the new arrangements with the satisfaction of a woman whose judgment had finally been validated, and the staff had settled into the revised distribution of responsibilities with the pragmatism of people who prefer clarity to confusion, regardless of how the clarity was arrived at. The West Holdings solicitor had reviewed the revised tenancy agreements and had noted, in his letter, that the new documentation was considerably more comprehensive than the previous documents, and that this would protect the estate in any future dispute. He had not said who had produced the documentation. It did not occur to him to wonder, presumably, whether it had been produced by the same person who had reviewed it on the first evening. She had filed his letter without comment. Her mother wrote once a month. The letters were warm and slightly careful, her mother's warmth and her mother's carefulness always present together, the way they had always been present together, inseparable now after a lifetime of being exercised simultaneously. She wrote about Hartwell, about Lotta's visit, and how Lotta had returned from Crestmore with the specific quality of converted person, about the garden at home, about Edmund. Her father was, she wrote, well. The estate accounts were being managed by a new man from the county. Things were, she wrote, stable. Mara had written back that she was glad, that Crestmore was extraordinary in November, that the work was substantial, and the north slope was progressing well, and the walled garden was resting under its winter mulch, and would be extraordinary in the spring. She had also written, in the third letter, something she had not planned to write, which was this: I find that I am well here, not merely adequate or managing or capable, which I expected, actually well, which I did not expect and which I am still in the process of understanding. I thought you should know. Her mother's reply to that letter had been shorter than usual, and the writing in it was slightly less controlled than usual, and she had not said very much at all, and Mara had understood what that meant, and had been glad, in her own particular quiet way, that her mother had received the information in the way it was intended. Lotta wrote considerably more often. Lotta wrote with the frequency of someone who has discovered a rich topic and intends to cover it thoroughly. She wrote about everything. Questions about the house, questions about the timber survey, because Mara had mentioned it, and Lotte found the idea of Mara on a hillside with a timber surveyor extremely diverting, for reasons she expressed with characteristic transparency. Questions about the north in winter. Questions about Aldrich. The questions about Aldrich were the most frequent, and the most varied, and the least answerable in the form they were usually posed. She answered what she could answer honestly, and left the rest. Aldrich himself was, in November, doing the work he had been away from for 4 years, which was the work of being the Duke of Crestmore in ways that went beyond the legal matter, and the accounts, and the estate management. There were responsibilities of a social and civic kind, relationships with neighboring families, and with the county administration, and with the people under the estate's stewardship, that had been managed in his absence, but that benefited from his presence, and he was attending to them with the consistent, patient attention he brought to everything he decided to do. She watched him do it. This was something she had noticed about herself. She watched him, not out of suspicion or analysis, but out of something more like the habit of careful attention applied to a subject she found consistently worth attending to. She watched the way he spoke to people, the way he listened, the way his face changed and did not change depending on what he was hearing. She watched him with Henry Marsh, whose competence he used appropriately, rather than either over-relying on or undervaluing. She watched him with the tenants, and with the county solicitor, and with the elderly man who came once a week from the village, and whose exact role in the estate she had not been able to fully establish, but who seemed to be someone Aldrich genuinely liked, and was genuinely glad to talk to. She watched him, and she was not surprised by what she saw, because it was consistent with everything she had been learning since the cart, and consistency was, she had found, the thing she trusted most. Not brilliance, not charm, not the kind of dramatic quality that announced itself loudly and demanded attention. Consistency. The same person in the library at night as in the field in the morning. The same quality of honesty in a legal dispute as in a kitchen conversation. The same hands. In the last week of November, he asked her to ride with him to the eastern boundary. She had learned to ride competently, not well, which was an honest assessment of the skill she had developed in the previous month and a half, because he had offered to teach her in October, and she had said yes, on the grounds that an estate this size was better understood from horseback than from foot, which was true, and was also a reason that coexisted with the one she did not offer, which was that she wanted to learn the thing he was offering to teach. She was competent enough by late November to ride to the eastern boundary, which was an hour at a pace she could manage, and she arrived at the boundary in good shape and stood her horse beside his and looked at the boundary, which was marked by a line of old stone markers, and beyond it, a change in the turf that indicated where the management of the land changed from Crestmore's to the next estates. "This is where the Whitmore boundary claim was focused," he said. She looked at the markers. They were old as the original documents, weathered to the same color as the turf around them, which gave them the quality of something that had simply always been there. "The boundary is clear from the ground," she said. "Yes, it always was. The confusion was in the documentation, not the landscape." She looked at the line of markers, which went north along the ridge for as far as she could see. The North Country winter light was on everything, that low, clear, deliberate light, and the hills were pale, and the sky above them was the particular color of winter sky that she did not have a word for in any vocabulary she had previously used. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "What did you think you were going to find?" she said. "When you decided on the arrangement. When you decided on me, specifically. What did you expect to find?" He was quiet for a moment. The horses shifted slightly on the turf. The boundary markers stood in the pale light. "I expected someone capable," he said. "I had asked for information about your father's estate and your situation, and I had been given accurate information. I knew you were managing the household, and I knew why. I thought I would find someone who was practical and clear-headed, and who would be a good partner in the management of a real estate. That is what you found," she said. "That is not all I found," he said. She looked at the boundary markers. "What else?" she asked. He thought for a moment, which he did with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, not as delay, but as the actual production of a considered answer. "I found someone who makes me want to think more carefully than I am already thinking," he said, "which is not something I expected from any arrangement. I found someone whose opinion I trust, which is different from finding someone whose opinion I respect, and I have been thinking about that difference for some time." She was quiet. "I found," he said, "that the distance across the kitchen table has been closing, in a way I did not plan for, and that I am not sorry about." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct, unguarded quality that was the face she knew best, the face that was the same in every room, in every situation, at every point of the day. "I am not sorry about it either," she said. The horses moved. The boundary markers stood. The winter light was on the hills, and the ridge, and the long line of old stone going north. She had a word now. She had had it for some time, for weeks, for most of November, a word that had arrived with the quietness of things that come when they are ready, rather than when you call them. She had been turning it over, checking its edges, testing it against the evidence, the way she tested numbers against comparable data, and the way she tested conclusions against the actual situation, and not against what she wished the situation to be. The word was her own word, not a borrowed one, not the word anyone would have suggested to her if they had known she was looking for one. It was the word for what it was to be seen correctly by someone who was not trying to sell you a version of yourself or manage you toward a particular outcome. The word for what it was to sit across a kitchen table from a person and not need to perform for them or protect yourself from them or calculate what they needed from you. The word for waking up in a room with a window over a valley and knowing that you chose to be in that room, not chose because there was no other option, but chose because the choice was real, and the thing you were choosing was also real. She did not say the word out loud. She did not need to, not yet, not today on the eastern boundary with the winter light on everything. But she had it. She kept it where she kept the things that were real and that mattered, in the place where the numbers were accurate, and the accounts were honest, and the ledger said what it said, without smoothing anything over. They rode back to Crestmore in the afternoon. and the house received them the way it received them now, with the warmth of a stone that has held heat for many hours and is giving it back. And Mrs. Clay had the range going, and the smell of the kitchen was wood and warmth, and something that had been cooking since morning. Mara hung her riding coat on the hook by the back door. She stood for a moment in the kitchen of Crestmore, with the winter afternoon outside the window, and the warmth inside, and the sound of Aldrich coming in behind her, and hanging his own coat on the hook beside hers, which was the hook beside hers, because that was where it went now, the two coats on adjacent hooks, which was a small thing, and not a small thing. She put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table. She waited for the kettle. Outside the window, the valley went from pale winter afternoon to the first gray edge of early dark, and the hills settled into themselves, and the old house held its warmth, and the coats hung on their hooks, and everything in the kitchen was exactly as ordinary, and exactly as real, as it had been since the beginning, which was the thing she trusted most about all of it. The kettle boiled. She made the tea. She brought his cup to the table and sat down with her own. He looked at her across the table, with the steady, ordinary, honest face that had been looking at her since the church, since the cart, since the first day of the farm, since the library, since the eastern boundary in the winter light. She looked back. The tea was hot, and the kitchen was warm, and the valley was going dark outside, and the word she had found was hers, and it was true, and it was enough, and more than enough, and exactly right, and she held it in the quiet place where she kept the things she was certain of, and she was, at this particular table, in this particular kitchen, with this particular man across from her, precisely as certain as she needed to be. Outside, the north wind moved over the ridge and through the valley and around the old stone walls of Crestmore, and the house held, and the hills held, and the two coats hung on adjacent hooks by the kitchen door, and the story of the cart and the disguise and the laughter in the church sat in Hartwell's collective memory, like a tale that had lost its ending, because the ending had turned out to be a beginning, which was the kind of ending that stories are least prepared for, and that life, in its better moments, provides anyway.